Everybody, and welcome to this week's HackerKast, brought to you by White Hat Security. My name is Jeremiah Grossman, and I am the founder of White Hat Security. And with me, as always, is Robert Arsenic Hansen out of Austin,
Hello.
and Matt Johansson out of Houston. So I got the Texas militia over here.
We're well armed too.
With a keyboard, right?
Yeah, that and many other things.
I've got my hacking fingers.
All right. So, like we do every week, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of cool current events. And fortunately, the community always delivers. There's always more news happening in the industry that we can possibly keep up with. In fact, every time we do one of these episodes, we have to pare down a list of like 20 stories into like 5 or 6 that we can actually spend a little time on. So hopefully this helps out everybody to stay up to speed on what's going on out there. And to jump into our first story, how can we not talk about this Ashley Madison website? It's a dating website, not unlike Adult Friend Finder, but one of the things it differentiates on is when married couples want to have extramarital affairs with other married couples, and that's kind of what it caters to. And there was an incident that Brian Krebs has reported on the last week and said something like 37 million users on this system had their information dumped. And you got to imagine they're probably not terribly happy right now.
This is a class action waiting to happen. Oh my God, can you imagine? Apparently they were about to go IPO too, or like just starting the process or something. So this is going to be a fairly interesting thing. Like, do they just decide, no, not going to go IPO anymore? And what does that do to the VC community? Like, this is their big payout right here, right? And if they're not going to get their big payout, I think heads are, A, heads are going to roll, but B, I think we're going to see a massive uptake in security from the VC community.
Yeah, this story
is to correlate the email addresses from the Ashley Madison breach to the email addresses from the OPM breach. Which government employees were members of Ashley Madison, and then you've got a blackmail recipe. Right?
Well, you might actually have blackmail just in the OPM breach alone.
Yeah.
And as you bring up OPM, I mean, that's got to be the only entity in this whole scenario that's happy about the Ashley Madison breach. Are the people at OPM going, thank God we're out of the news for 5 frickin' minutes. But, this story was pretty interesting because there was extortion involved. So apparently the bad guys have only dropped snippets of the data that they reportedly stole, and Brian Krebs and Ashley Madison were, they validated it. But there's some extortion. They said, shut down the website or we're going to dump all the data. That's pretty fierce.
I mean, we've seen this before with the Sony breach. This is a bit different, though. This one, it's a little confusing what the purpose of this is, because it doesn't seem like this person is particularly interested in money per se, or maybe there's competitive sites out there that want to take them down, and this is one way to do it, especially right before an IPO, or make their IPO not worth very much. It's pretty interesting. Who knows, right?
So to speculate on absolutely no evidence, this to me smells like an insider here. There's somebody that worked there, didn't like the way they were operating, and had a crisis of conscience and figured out a way to hack them to shut them down. That was their only.
I don't know.
Only
avenue. Like a vengeful spouse who had
I think you're right, Jerry. I think it probably was an insider, because there was some mention to I think the COO or something like that, or chief security officer, this guy is not to blame. He did the best he could, kind of thing. It seems like why would the hacker or hackers mention them by name in such a positive way just after immediately destroying them from a security perspective? So it's a good chance they've met or had some sort of interaction before.
One thing we didn't find is that no one ever said is how they broke in. So that might tell us a lot, but that's no one ever said. So I guess we'll follow along to see if there is a class action or something like that.
Yeah, the hacker did post a YouTube video where they said they were downloading for 4 days because it was many, 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 many gigs worth of data. So that would imply that whatever Ashley Madison was doing from a security perspective, they weren't exactly being very aware of what was egressing from their network.
Yeah, they were not monitoring the crazy amount of data that was currently exfiltrated. Like, how does what?
Yeah.
So in good fashion, Troy Hunt jumps in on the action. And for those that don't know Troy Hunt, he's an excellent blogger in the application security industry. And he goes, well, you don't really need a hack to figure out who's using the system. So the hack he showed, well, let me back up. So you know how most of the websites out there, they use email addresses synonymous with the usernames? And if you try to register an account, it might tell you that account's already registered. Or you might try to reset a password, and it says, well, that email address is or isn't registered. That's kind of a really easy and cheap way to determine what email addresses are registered on the system, so you can actually tell who on the system is registered. And that alone is a pretty interesting privacy leak that he found on Ashley Madison, but it's certainly not unique to them. And so there's a lot of sites out there you can mine this way.
I think Troy was just trying to get into his account. He's like, wait, did I already authenticate this?
But I think Robert, in your experience, like spammers were using this a lot just to mine email addresses, valid email addresses. But this might be an interesting way to embarrass people. Like, you have an account in Ashley Madison or whatever the site is. What are you doing?
I've used similar techniques. For instance, there was a social networking site I messed with that you can't friend anyone under 18 for obvious reasons if you're over 18 unless you know their name. And so all you have to do is just guess. You just guess really rapidly, and there's no limits, and you can figure out someone's name and get into their account. So I think stuff like this is pretty common, especially in sites that large, because they want to cut down on customer service costs as much as possible. So the more information they can give users on the way in, or as they're trying to friend people or whatever, the easier it is for them to continue to stay engaged in the site and the lower customer service costs in the process.
So this is all, so there's lots of business logic flaws out there. This is just one in the many of them that are not necessarily, I don't know if you call this a security issue. Maybe a privacy leak would be better. Some sites might rate this higher, other ones lower. In the case of Ashley Madison site or any other dating website, it actually might be quite sensitive who your users are, so they might have to take better precautions against this.
Absolutely.
All right, so that's Ashley Madison there. So we'll see 37 million people. That's one heck of a class action lawsuit. So we'll see what, I guess maybe the FTC is going to have to get involved in this.
Yeah, probably.
All right, so we touched on privacy a little bit in this regard. And there was some interesting research that, Robert, you found with regards to Firefox's tracking cookies and the load time. So what was the story here?
Yeah, so apparently there was some research done on this this particular setting. You can, and we have a link to this, and that we can put in the meeting information or whatever at the end of this. But effectively, if you turn on this one setting that's completely buried, it's not one of those things you're going to find by clicking around. It's inside About Config. But if you enable it, effectively it uses Google's API to pull down a list of known sites that are attempting to track you. And by doing that, it effectively blocks them from being downloaded, which has an effect of blocking something like 44% of the load time, just right there. Just it goes 44% faster. And something, I forget the number now, but 30-something% of the total bandwidth, which if you're like on an airplane or if you're in some third world country or something, and you're using latent satellite connections or on an oil rig somewhere or whatever, that's actually a very substantial amount of bandwidth and therefore cost. So from a privacy perspective, it's okay. It's still leaking information to Google, which is not great, but it is not leaking information to all these other websites. And it's also not leaking information to Google on every page hit. It's pulling it down once every couple of hours or whatever, very similar to the anti-phishing and anti-malware lists that Google currently uses inside Firefox. So it is a bit of a privacy leak, but nowhere near as bad as not having it. So if you had to pick one of the two, I still think that there's better options out there, disconnect being one of them, that do exactly the same thing.
So this is kind of huge, 44% bandwidth utilization for, just to support advertising and tracking. I mean, if you went to any CIO, system and said, hey, I got this idea, we can cut 44% of our bandwidth off the top with no impact on users' experience. I mean, that's huge. That's amazing.
So the part that's a little misleading when you're talking about that, I agree. Right there, I totally agree. But I think a better way to say it is you can increase the performance of people surfing by 44%. Because if you talk about it as in your cost savings, it implies that the rest of the time they're not doing that search. They're doing something else. But in reality, they're just going to do a different search after they're done with that one, right? They're just going to surf. They're going to find something else to go search. So I think it's good. It is very important to do it, but it's not really going to save you bandwidth, if that makes sense.
So this is really interesting because, like, doesn't Amazon post a bunch of this research that they have that directly correlates amount of money they make to like load time down to milliseconds, right? Like if the page loads, however many milliseconds faster, they make X more dollars, right? So I mean, you look at something like this and you say, okay, well, if you're talking about millisecond performance time, and this is a huge different performance hit, right? Like, you can directly correlate this to money made for a website like that, and exactly what you're talking about of, like, oh, your company's just performance time sitting around waiting for something to load.
Yeah, unless your site is the kind of site that is driven by ads. And then this is terrifying because you make all your money off of being able to retarget people and figure out who they are and figure out what their interests are and whatever. So for Amazon, that's probably okay-ish, but for so many companies, it's not good. And long term, I think that is the way it's going to go. I mean, this blocking is so pervasive, especially in countries like Germany, for instance. This is just the way the things are going, and anybody who relies on third-party JavaScript on the site for tracking customer, anything is definitely missing a huge chunk of their user base.
When I traveled down to South Africa years ago, even way back then, years ago, ad blocking on the client was very pervasive. Everybody used it, and actually it was pervasive on university networks and corporate environments. And in the U.S. we get kind of spoiled in that kind of view because our bandwidth that we use, we pay a monthly fee and we get it's feasibly unlimited. Down there, they were paying by the meg. And so blocking ads for them reduced bandwidth and direct costs. So that was a really big deal for those guys who pay by the meg, and I'm sure in South Africa isn't the only country that does so.
Yeah, I would hardly call South Africa a third world country. That's a fairly industrialized country. But there are so many places that really are just like that, and a meg might be all the bandwidth you can even get for an entire day if you're like on a really, really slow connection, like those old cellular to satellite type connections and stuff. Just spotty intermittent connection, cloud cover or whatever might make it nearly impossible.
So we got this other related story here, Robert, about an Apple iAd, or Apple has their iAd advertising network, and there was an exec that left, and the reason why he left was pretty interesting.
Yeah. So this guy named Winston Crawford recently left to go to some other very scary location, but on his way out the door, he basically said, I don't believe that Apple is interested in this capability, and the capability being this really hyper-targeted stuff with ads, because they have a strict policy around what they can do with user data, which effectively means to you and me as people who probably care about privacy quite a bit, if you're listening to this, effectively means they're neutering themselves in a good way from your perspective. He said, iAd has great assets and great capabilities, but they're going to follow Apple's policy to the letter of the law, which is good. But then he went to this place called Drawbridge, and it said, Drawbridge's technology works to identify users by applying machine learning techniques to large amounts of data generated from the devices. The goal is to estimate the probability that multiple devices belong to the same person. If a desktop computer and smartphone are connected to the same Wi-Fi, the network will recognize the unique ID of each device and pass the information to Drawbridge. So, I mean, talk about de-anonymizing people. This is this is about as bad as it possibly can get. I think that there are just some people who just don't care at all about people's privacy, and this would be one example of that.
So it's kind of cool that you could see the less than moral people in Apple's advertising ecosystem departing on their own. They're self-selecting out. That's pretty cool, I think.
I think it speaks volumes. I think Apple probably could do better, but frankly, if even one of these people, and he was their COO, I mean, he wasn't exactly like low on the totem pole. If their COO is saying that I can't be malicious inside their network, that's great. privacy wins.
So we got so that's going on, and let's try a different story here. Still web related, and a little bit of a business logic flaw. Matt was looking at this one. The headline reads, Miami cops actively working to sabotage Waze with fake submissions. Now, first, Matt, you might have to explain what exactly Waze is, because I don't think everybody uses this thing.
Okay, so Waze is a GPS like map app, like directions app, right? That's supposed to be better than like default Apple Maps. Let's not even get started, but something like Google Maps or whatever that people use, like GPS type things. But Waze actually does a lot of crowdsourcing. So like if you use it in your phone and you pass an accident, you can, of course, very safely use your phone while driving and report that accident. But also, it like auto will detect if you're slowing down, and so it can report traffic jams like in real time based on users with the app open. So this app happened to be purchased by Google a few years back, and now they advertise like directly into the app, like, oh, hit this, and we'll direct you to Burger King over here. And we'll also track all of these people using it and where they're driving and where they're going, right? But that's besides the point. So this whole crowdsourcing thing, the information that's displayed on my app on my phone is just based on some other user hitting a few buttons while they were driving or whatever it is, right? So we've seen a few stories pop up in the past of falsifying data on this. I think last year we saw in San Francisco people couldn't stand that Waze kept sending people on a shortcut down this residential street to avoid traffic. The neighborhood was getting pissed off about it, so every day right around that time they would go out and report traffic jams on their block so that Waze would not send people down their block anymore, right?
Anymore.
Yeah. And so now it looks like the other major use of this app besides just traffic jams is you can report if you pass a cop, like sitting with the radar gun out on the side of the road, right? So if you're on your road trip, it'll notify you, hey, you've got a cop a mile ahead of you, slow down. So, super useful for a ton of people, right? But so cops are, wising up to this, and it looks like this was in Miami that like thousands of these police officers, hundreds of police officers downloaded the apps and are just reporting cops, wherever, just fake data to report the cops so that the users don't know which one's real and which one's fake. But the cops are the one doing it. It's not like just people trying to get people not to come down their neighborhood. Falsifying data in this app, right? Like obviously, there's no laws against this, right? But it's,
I mean, CFAA clearly does not cover falsifying data.
Yeah. So, this is pretty interesting that the cops are getting in on the fake data train here.
I mean, not that I think Google really wants to pick fights with cops because Google owns Waze, but if I were Google, I'd be very tempted to file a suit against them and try to get them arrested for falsifying that data. I'd be very tempted because I think the case law that came from it would be very interesting either way. I mean, if it's okay for people to falsify data, well, then we have this whole new burgeoning thing where everyone's falsifying data everywhere. I don't think it would go that way. I think the cops would actually get busted for it, and probably should be busted for it. But maybe there would be some exclusion for cops. Who knows?
One of the cops argues is that this is invasion of the cops' privacy of where they are located. So if people wanted to do some harm to a police officer, they could open Waze and say, "Oh, there's a cop. I'm going to go like hurt this police officer," or whatever it is, And yeah, the argument just gets shot down. It's like, hey, if some mentally ill person wants to do ill to a police officer, they don't need Waze to find the police officer.
No, they can call 911 and then a whole bunch of them show up.
Really giant building that says police on it, and whatever it is, right? That's kind of a stupid argument in my.
Really stupid. Yeah.
I could see Google sending a cease and desist over to them, because I think the last thing Google wants, I mean, they don't care about this particular issue. They don't care if people report cops or don't report cops or get tickets or not. I think but if people don't trust the validity of the data because you have a threat actor like the police screwing with the data, that hurts the brand, that hurts the product, and causes users to flee. I think Google might care about that one enough to send law enforcement a cease and desist this behavior and ban their accounts.
There's another weird side thing here. This also comes into selective prosecution. Like if any government agency ever tried to prosecute somebody on falsifying data, and they didn't arrest these cops for doing it, you now fall under selective prosecution, where a good defense lawyer would be able to say, sorry, you didn't go after those cops, and that was public, that was all over the news. Why are you going after my client? That doesn't make sense.
In those cases,
the thought is that Google probably can tell which phone devices belong to police officers and not allow that data to show up.
Yep.
It's just another scary thought. It wouldn't probably be a hard thing for Google to figure out what their data pool.
Yep.
But anyway.
So business logic flaws. I remember we got spoofing of data. You could actually extract data with Troy Hensel hack there. That's pretty cool. So let's move on. Let's talk more about direct AppSec stuff. So the SANS Institute put out a survey, and the survey came in the form of a report, the 2015 State of Application Security, Closing the Gap. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time to spend going through all the cool data in this report, but I can tell you that they sent out the survey to qualified people, and about 435 respondents came back. So it's a good representation of the industry, at least for two different types. Now, they had people self-identify as being either a builder or a defender. So a builder is someone who is part of the software development lifecycle. They try to build secure code that is resilient from outside attack. Then defenders are those that actively try to, prevent attacks on the live production system. So builders are different than defenders. So I'm just going to read.
Where's the breakers?
You know what? They conveniently left out the breakers. I was kind of heartbroken about that, but we're not going to go there. So it definitely is a good report to read. But the interesting part is that, I was just looking at the exec summary because I went through all the data. I was trying to understand little nuances here and there. The executive summary had these 3 bullet points based on builder and defender, and they're very different from each other. So with the builders, here are their 3 top-of-mind issues. The defenders. Identifying all applications in the portfolio. Obviously, that's got to be, if you have to defend systems, you have to know what application you have, and discovery is a little bit of a difficult subject in this industry. Mm-hmm. The other one is fear of modifying production code and potentially breaking the application. Okay, that was there.
Makes sense.
And organizations and communication silos between security application development and the rest of the organization. So that was the challenges defender teams had working with the builders. So then you got the inverse, right? You have the builders are very, very different, and because their goals and priorities are different. So the first thing is that they needed to focus on delivering features and on time to market, not necessarily security. We've all been there. We've seen that. Mm-hmm. Second, lack of skills or knowledge to build secure software. The business says, hey, go build some secure software, and the builder's like, don't know how. Know how to build features, not secure features. 2 different things. And the third one is lack of management buy-in or funding. So it seems like security is still promoted bottom-up rather than top-down. So how do you get management on board with, even if you know how to build secure code, if the business is unwilling to pay for it?
You show them a news story that says, hey, these people just got hacked and they can no longer IPO.
Oh, Matt, just throw it down right there. But what we did see is they did ask about spending patterns in the industry, and amongst the 435 respondents, it looks like spending is trending upward across the range for application security. About 3/4 said there was a slight increase, and about 1/4 said that there is a significant increase in application security spending. Very few people are spending less. But since a lot of the dollars in InfoSec goes to firewalls and antivirus, it's really tough to get AppSec funded.
Cool.
Makes sense.
So good data is good data. So if you haven't seen the report, haven't downloaded it, you give it a read. It won't take more than 10, 15 minutes to get through, and it's always good to see what insights there are in the industry. Let's do some more. One more cutting edge hack that I think we knew in our hearts was possible, but it just really took someone demonstrating that it was actually possible. So the headline reads, and this is one Matt was covering, researcher proves HTML5 can be used to hide malware. Great.
I love it, right? Come on. Like last year we had scriptless cross-site scripting due to HTML5. Like, okay, great, awesome. This is fantastic. So, so yeah, for those of you not familiar with like some drive-by malware techniques, a lot of times the malware will be chunked up, like when it's attempted to be downloaded to your browser, so that to help avoid detection, right? But a lot of those traditional chunking methods are now detectable by modern, malware protection and antivirus type stuff. So what these researchers did, instead of using those old chunking techniques, they have 3 different methods of this, but what they all have in common is that they use these HTML5 APIs and features to help do the malware reassembly on the back end, right? So things like Canvas, WebSockets, web workers, local storage, what else? IndexedDB, WebSQL, cross-origin, client communication, and the file API. So like you take all of those and, okay, we're going to use a web worker for this part of it, we're going to use WebSockets, we're going to use local storage, and then in the browser recombine all of it and then execute the malware. And yeah, they proved that the same piece of malware with traditional chunking methods, and then they have 3 different methods of combining these things. They call them delegated preparation, which delegates the preparation to system APIs. Then there's distributed preparation, which goes across several concurrent independent processes of like a WebSocket process, a web worker process. And then this one's really interesting, the user-driven preparation. Through user interaction, let the user trigger a bunch of different execution things on the page during the time that they spend on the page, that those interaction pieces, will fire off some JavaScript event that triggers something that reassembles the malware. So the users unknowingly kind of shooting themselves in the foot.
Pretty cool.
But yeah, these all bypassed, modern dynamic and static malware detection analysis engines, things like that. So pretty cool stuff. I think this will almost certainly be on the list of candidates for top 10 web hacks.
So yeah, malware's everywhere, and wow, AV is going to be less effective? Okay.
How is that even possible?
Yeah, it's funny. We talk about this, all the time. There's always articles of how AV is not going to catch this, AV is not going to catch that, and they come up to speed eventually, but they're always a day late and $1 short, and that's just the thing out there. It's the bad guys adapt really, really quickly. They adapt quickly. They send it out fast, and everybody's infected before the AV guys can catch up. And I don't know if there's a great way around this problem, except maybe the walled garden that Apple approach is doing.
All apps, everything driven by apps. I mean, it works. They've been very successful. That's why there's a lot less malware on the iOS App Store versus the Android App Store, as an example.
So it begs the question: how long before standard OSs are similar, if not identical, to like iOS or Android?
I mean, that Google's desktop actually is probably the closest attempt we've seen so far, GOS. But I think the problem is people like being able to have things on their computer. They like being able to pull stuff from their local drive. And as much as Google really wants everyone to use the cloud, sometimes it's just very inconvenient. Like I'm on a flight and the go-go wireless goes out or whatever, or I'm just skiing somewhere and the Wi-Fi is extremely spotty. Like sometimes I like to be able to work without having to rely on the internet. And until they completely fix that problem, I think that having stuff on your local computer is just kind of the way things have to go.
Yep. So always fun stuff in application security land. Ashley Madison website's getting hacked. You got the cops trying to screw with the data on Waze. It's always a fun time out there. So I guess it's up to us to keep up to speed and help everybody else out there do the same. So if you like what we're doing here, please rate, please subscribe. Hey, send us some stories. Thank you very much.
See ya.
Bye now.